My name is Emery Brusset. I'm an evaluation consultant. I've been doing evaluations for the past 28 years, all full-time, and focusing on conflict environments in particular. And I've been increasingly brought into environmental aspects also, the overlap between environment and conflict. Before that, I used to work for the UN in humanitarian assistance programs based in France and working for a wide range of clients. What I'll be talking about is a very difficult thing to do, which I strongly recommend to anybody engaging in evaluation, which is to let the context in to the evaluation, to take into account what's happening around the intervention, go all the way to the people who are in contact with the situation, the country, the actors that are to be influenced by an intervention, by an initiative. So just to be really clear, it's about making the subject matter speak, letting people tell their story, and then building that story around the kinds of outputs, outcomes, impacts that an initiative is seeking to have. I think for everybody, the idea of taking into account the context seems obvious and a natural thing to do, but I'll explain why that was. How that dawned on me through 4 different assignments, 3 of which relate to UNEP, the UN Environmental Programme, and evaluations I've done for them. The first was an evaluation commissioned in 2016 of what was called the Environmental Cooperation Programme, which was about peace building through a number of countries. There was a case study in Afghanistan, which allowed me to go there in early 17 and to understand a lot better what it means to run a conflict and environment program in such a country. The second is an evaluation of the climate security mechanism, which is a not very well-known mechanism, and a group of entities, 4 entities at the Secretariat of the UN in New York, including UNDP, UNEP, but also peacekeeping and political affairs. And this was an evaluation of their functioning over the years. The purpose of the mechanism is to bring in this notion of climate and security. And thirdly, I was asked by UNEP again, the evaluation unit, to look at 2 projects which have ended now in Afghanistan, which actually followed my first visit. So gave me a different perspective on the same subject and the same problems. And fourth, I'll touch on something I did for a completely different agency, the World Food Programme in Philippines, where I was given a lot more resources. I wasn't working alone as I was for the other 3. I had a team of about 20 people. We ran surveys and focus group discussions with the population in the southern island of Mindanao, in an area called the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. So these 3 projects are how I'll explain why we think we know what the context is, but actually it's often escaping and needs a very specific effort. When I started the first evaluation of UNEP, there were a number of case studies, and we were asked to do a theory of change of the program as a whole. A lot of documents were shared, and I did quite a few interviews, even in Geneva, in Nairobi, and remotely with other partners. And I thought I was getting a good handle on it. I was beginning to tell the story, which is really about whether the objectives were met, which activities were carried out, and then making a claim that a particular set of outputs were contributing to a certain level of outcome. But then when I arrived in Afghanistan, I realized two things which I hadn't at all anticipated. One is how difficult the environment is, how cut off the staff in Afghanistan felt, and left, how much they were left to their own workarounds, their own solutions for problems that had to do with local, very weak local capacities, the security, um, and so on and so forth. And it made me realize that if I had not gone down, I would probably have written a relatively superficial report. And it's the contact with people that makes the difference. They have their own way of seeing, and they have their own objectives. They may not formally report them because everybody is supposed to reflect the original objectives. In fact, they translate these objectives into their own environment, into what they're trying to do. And the people they work with have their own objective and their own translation of the objectives, and the communities have their own objective. And so unless you understand how these four sets of objectives, and there may be more, actually coincide, it's very difficult to understand what the initiative is actually doing. The climate security mechanism was a desk-based study, and it was involving people sitting in capitals or at headquarters, agency headquarters. And I was given complete freedom as to who I would speak to. I spoke to people who were sitting in peacekeeping missions or political missions in Congo, in the US, in Asia, and speaking to them, I realized that this mechanism has a team of about 12, 13 people at its center, and then carries out projects all over the world. The projects themselves fit into a different institutional environment, and it was again speaking to them that I realized what really was going on. Here, the trick is that you need to push for the people who are closest to the implementation. Otherwise, you tend to get the agency story, the organizational agenda repeated, which is a pity. The Afghanistan projects followed on after my first visit, and when I looked at them again, and I'm actually doing this evaluation now, I realized that a lot of changes were already happening that I hadn't picked up during my field visit. And of course, there's the story of the takeover by the Taliban of Kabul in August 2021. But beyond that, there was also the story of how UNEP changed from having a project focus, a field focus, to being much more of a policy agency, and how that affected the staff and the projects on the ground. And here, it took a while to find the people who had been involved, because a lot of them had to flee Afghanistan, were refugees in places like Albania waiting for a visa. And they had if you give them time and you don't prepare the interview too much, if you don't have an interview protocol that you have to go through, if you let them go with their story and what's in their mind, it becomes really interesting. Finally, on the Philippines project, what I wanted to say, and this is the reason I'm introducing this now, we all know that the Philippines is affected by climate change. We know climate change is increasing conflict. These truisms are reflected often in surveys about access to water, migration, loss of livelihoods. What we did there is start with a mapping of drivers. So a focus group discussion using a map, events and trends, leading to the identification of key drivers. And these drivers are not something we would have thought of. For example, indigenous communities in Mindanao were talking about the fact that they felt the people representing them in government discussions were not reflecting their point of view, even their language, their concepts, their values. And that can only come through from a very careful consultation. So basically, primary data is important. We all know we need to read reports, we need to read the log frames, check the indicators, reporting against indicators. But the key thing is primary data from people on, this expression at the coal face. It's a good metaphor to describe where people really are paying of their own lives and their own energy to pursue the objectives of a particular initiative. And that needs to be prepared. It needs to be designed in the approach. The methodology needs to be designed in such a way that you can be surprised. You can let these stakeholders speak and tell their story. So the lessons learned from these exercises are, as you picked up, the subject matter often is not very structured. So all these initiatives, of all these initiatives, 2 had theories of change at the beginning, the others didn't. You have to reconstruct things, you have to map who the stakeholders are, and then you sometimes redo the theory of change, you identify your evidence, and you move forward. And then you discover that those that did have theories of change were a little bit clunky, didn't work, or were not followed, were disrupted by a coup, by a takeover in Afghanistan. Or secondly, that in fact, the people you had identified earlier on, the assumptions you were probing, are not the right ones. They're not really the interesting ones. So my first lesson learned is a bit controversial. All of them will be. But the first lesson learned is don't let yourself be locked in by the inception phase, by the initiation, the first stages, the preparatory stages, the framing of the evaluation. It's important to have a sort of midpoint review, maybe with your the people who commission the evaluation, to check that you are moving a little bit beyond and changing the approach, maybe changing your lines of inquiry. And that's okay, that's important. They should be able to understand, they may not. The second is that the real experts in an initiative are the people who are pushing it. In the case of the climate security mechanism, these may be diplomats negotiating around the Security Council resolutions. It may be people who are advising special envoys in Nairobi. They are experts to a greater degree than people who are actually managing the information, managing the project. The managers often get a bit isolated from the outcomes, the changes in behavior and changes in knowledge that come with a project. The third lesson learned, and this is really even more controversial, is that maybe we should not think that cause and effect relations are linear. The evaluation world is dominated by what can be called contribution analysis or theory-based analysis, where you look at the theory, you test it, and then maybe you change it. The theory is often a cascade of effects, going from activities all the way down to impact. And sometimes there are 2 or 3 or 4 levels. This is a linear model. The big school of thought is around experimental methods with control groups. So we know what exposure we want, what is the treatment that is to be applied. In fact, these assume a predictability and a linear causal flow, which may not exist in the real world. I would say that linearity is actually the exception. We should accept, particularly when dealing with environments and dealing with conflict, that complexity dominates. That complexity is about uncertainty. It's about the fact that particular activities lead to outcomes we could not predict, or outcomes we had predicted were not delivered, but other outcomes were happened. And they may have happened in a different context after the Taliban took over. Things went on in Afghanistan, and the communities were still trying to address climate change. They were using their stoves. There were shuras or development committees that were still functioning, but they function in a different way, in a new way. And so the old theories of change were thrown out of the window, but new good things were happening. And I would say that to rely on experimental methods, to rely on contribution analysis, is assuming that the world is a linear world. And yet, increasingly, we're not dealing with linearity, especially if it's about peace building. And so I would say we need to look carefully for alternative methods. I'm not going to go into them because these are not based on the case studies I did, but I do think we're reaching a point now where we need to ask ourselves, are these theories of change, these careful systems of indicators, these randomized studies, these control groups, are these really the right tools we should apply to environment, climate change, peace building, security? And I would argue probably not, but I'll leave it to you to think. So an evaluation is always a journey, and you always finish thinking, if I'd known this at the beginning, or if I had been aware. And sometimes, sadly, you realize you spent a lot of time barking up the wrong tree, trying to collect information that may not prove to be particularly useful. In all these studies, what I found as in a way the most surprising was how approaching it from a particular. So you're working with a community. Sorry, I'll step back a bit. Are you working with a community with a number of stakeholders, which are a reference group or generally the commissioners, sometimes the clients who will be reading the evaluation, and they have particular questions, particular approaches. And then you discover that these need to be reframed. If you were to do it again, you find that you would chase different case studies. You would structure them much more narrowly than you have to get to these stakeholders that were, in the end, the most meaningful. In each case, for example, for the environmental cooperation program, the key thing turned out to be the capacities, the partners on the ground with which UNEP was working. In the case of the climate security mechanism, it was those operations where this concept of climate security was best delimited. If there was a region, if there was a particular trigger, a particular stress or shock that was being analyzed. In the case of the projects which I'm looking at now for UNEP, it does come down to the interface with key partner institutions and communities. And so spending time finding them is important. Finding a good way of interacting with them turned out to be important. And life and work, we always need more time than we really are given. And so in terms of surprises, it's really the importance of moving away from that early framing and then finding those people at the end that were the gems of the evaluation. Valuable. The aspects that will speak the best are identifying key activities, what the real activities delivered were, and then secondly, matching them against the context, the drivers, the pivotal factors in the context, seeing how these activities interacted with these drivers, with these pivots. Activities are recognized by everybody. Everyone knows where an activity was delivered, how long it lasted, what the outputs were. What the outcomes are or what the impact is is much more blurred. So finding activities, advice number one. Advice number two, match it against the context that you will have discovered through your case studies, through your field experiment, whatever method you choose. So broader reflections around these evaluations. Firstly, my own inadequacy in understanding climate, biodiversity, environmental change, environmental degradation. This is my expertise is in evaluations. It's in peace and conflict analysis. It's a very different field from that where environmental specialists work. And it's not easy to bring that expertise into the evaluation field. So there's a big need for people who have environmental expertise and evaluation expertise to move into the field of peace building, understanding conflict dynamics, triggers, and vice versa. It's a rare profile. And I wish there were more of it, because we're still experimenting. We're still finding our way in this overlay of two topics.